The rifle Germany learned to hate. They did not hate the American soldier at first. They did not hate the uniform, the helmet, or the flag stitched to his sleeve. They hated what they could not control. They hated the moment when a firefight should have slowed down, but didn't. They hated the instant when an American rifle kept firing, again and again without pause. They hated the realization that something on the battlefield had changed, and it was changing against them. That hatred began with a sound, a brief, metallic sound, sharp, cold, unmistakable. A sound that meant the American rifle was empty and that it was about to be full again. But to understand why German soldiers came to fear and despise the American M1 rifle, we need to go back long before Normandy, long before North Africa, long before the first American boots ever touched European soil. We need to go back to the end of the First World War, the war that was supposed to end all wars. When the guns finally fell silent in 1918, military planners across the world studied the battlefield with brutal honesty. The lessons were impossible to ignore. Artillery had dominated. Machine guns had slaughtered men in numbers never seen before. Entire offensives had been reduced to meaningless bloodshed by belts of automatic fire. And standing in the middle of all of this destruction was the ordinary infantryman. He was still armed much the same way his father had been, a bolt-action rifle. Reliable, accurate, simple, but slow. Every single shot required deliberate manual effort. The soldier had to lift the bolt, pull it back, eject the spent cartridge, push it forward, lock it down, reacquire his sight picture, and fire again. Under perfect conditions, this was manageable. Under fire, with bullets snapping overhead and artillery shaking the ground, it was anything but. The United States Army reached a conclusion that many others were reluctant to accept. Infantry firepower was no longer keeping pace with modern warfare. If wars were going to be decided by speed, volume of fire, and constant pressure, then the individual soldier needed to evolve. The Army did not want to rely solely on machine guns to provide fire superiority. Machine guns were heavy, they required crews, they required logistics and protection. What the Army wanted was far more dangerous. They wanted every rifleman to fire faster. They wanted every soldier to stay on target. They wanted sustained fire without sacrificing mobility. They wanted a semi-automatic rifle as standard issue. So, in 1919, the United States Army officially began the search for a self-loading service rifle. This was not a fantasy. Semi-automatic firearms already existed in the civilian world. Companies like Remington and Winchester had been producing self-loading hunting rifles since the early 1900s. The concept was proven. The Chief of Ordnance himself openly stated that the Army was willing to test a semi-automatic rifle as soon as someone could submit one that worked. And yet, year after year passed. Designs were submitted, trials were conducted, promises were made. Nothing succeeded. The reason for the failure was not a lack of engineering talent. It was not a lack of ambition. It came down to a single unforgiving factor: the .30-06 cartridge. The U.S. Army was deeply committed to this round. It was powerful, accurate, and devastating at long range. It had been tested out to distances far beyond what most soldiers would ever engage. It could penetrate cover, defeat enemy positions, and maintain lethality at extreme ranges. But that power created enormous challenges. The .30-06 generated high chamber pressure. It required a heavy powder charge. The cartridge itself was long and demanding. Any semi-automatic rifle had to contain that pressure while cycling a heavy bolt at high speed, shot after shot without failure. Early self-loading mechanisms simply could not survive it. They cracked under stress. They jammed when fouled. They became unreliable when exposed to mud,
dust and rain. To make a semi-automatic rifle strong enough meant making it large and heavy, too heavy for general infantry issue. The Army tested domestic designs, foreign submissions, and experimental concepts, including unusual concepts like the Danish Bang rifle. None of them could balance strength, reliability, and weight. Then, in 1919, a reserved Canadian-American engineer named John Cantius Garand arrived at Springfield Armory. Garand approached the problem differently. Instead of fighting the power of the cartridge, he chose to manage it. Instead of forcing mechanical parts to absorb punishment, he designed a system that redistributed energy. His breakthrough was the gas-operated action. When the rifle fired, a small portion of the propellant gases was tapped from the barrel and redirected into a cylinder beneath it. Those gases pushed against a piston connected to an operating rod. That rod cycled the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round. The rifle used its own energy to function. The forces were spread out. The stress was controlled. The system survived where others failed. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Garand's rifles consistently outperformed competitors in Army trials. They fired reliably. They endured punishment. They worked when other designs broke. But even then, adoption was not guaranteed. At one point, the Army seriously considered abandoning the .30-06 cartridge altogether. A lighter round, the .27-6 Pedersen, was tested. It reduced recoil. It simplified engineering. It allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. In 1930, the .27-6 Garand actually won formal recommendation for adoption, but logistics killed it. The United States still possessed massive stockpiles of .30-06 ammunition left over from World War I. In the middle of the Great Depression, no one was willing to discard those reserves or rebuild an entire supply chain. Garand was ordered back to the drawing board. Once again, he had to make the impossible work. Years of refinement followed, more testing, more internal debate, until finally, on January 9, 1936, the U.S. Army made a decision that would change infantry combat forever. The rifle was adopted as the U.S. rifle, caliber .30 M1. For the first time in history, a major military power had standardized a semi-automatic rifle as its primary infantry weapon. While most armies of the world would enter the Second World War still issuing bolt-action rifles, the United States had leaped ahead by an entire generation. Factories ramped up production at a pace no one else could match. By mid-1941, thousands of M1 rifles were rolling off assembly lines every month. War was coming, and soon, German soldiers would discover what it meant to face an enemy whose rifle never needed a bolt to be worked by hand. This was only the beginning. In the next part, we'll break down how the M1 actually functioned in combat, why its most famous sound became legendary, and how myths were born in the middle of gunfire and chaos.
When American troops first arrived on the battlefield, nothing about them looked revolutionary. They wore familiar uniforms. They marched like any other army. They carried rifles slung over their shoulders like soldiers had done for generations. And at a distance, those rifles looked ordinary. Wooden stocks, long barrels, steel receivers. To German eyes, they appeared to be just another bolt-action rifle. The illusion lasted only until the first shots were fired. German infantry had been trained for a specific rhythm of combat, a rhythm shaped by decades of doctrine and experience. Fire, pause, reload, fire again. The battlefield breathed in cycles, moments of violence followed by brief lulls. Against most armies, that rhythm held. Against the Americans, it shattered. The first thing German soldiers noticed was not accuracy, it was not range, it was speed. American riflemen did not lower their rifles between shots. They did not reach up to work a bolt.
They did not break their cheek weld or lose their sight picture. They simply kept firing. 8 rounds in rapid succession, delivered with deliberate aim, each shot following the last with mechanical inevitability. What German troops initially mistook for light machine gun fire was, in reality, ordinary riflemen engaging targets at will. This was the M1 Garand in action. The heart of the rifle was its gas-operated system. Each time a round was fired, a portion of the propellant gases was diverted from the barrel. Those gases drove a piston, which moved the operating rod, which in turn rotated and unlocked the bolt. The spent cartridge was ejected, a fresh round was chambered, the bolt locked again. All of this happened in a fraction of a second. The shooter did not need to move his hands. He did not need to think about the mechanism. The rifle did the work for him. This had profound consequences. A soldier armed with a bolt-action rifle could fire accurately, but only as fast as he could manipulate the bolt. Under stress, that speed dropped. Fine motor skills degraded. Fatigue set in. The M1 eliminated that limitation. An American rifleman could maintain a steady rate of aimed fire 2 to 3 times higher than his enemy. Not spray fire, not panic fire, controlled, repeatable shots delivered with discipline. On the battlefield, that difference translated into pressure. German units began reporting encounters where American positions seemed far more heavily armed than they actually were. Squads assumed they were facing multiple machine guns, when in reality they were facing ordinary infantrymen with semi-automatic rifles. The psychological impact was immediate. Advances stalled faster. Cover felt less safe. Exposing oneself, even briefly, became far more dangerous. Then there was the sound, the distinctive metallic ping. When the last round in the rifle was fired, the internal clip was ejected upward from the receiver. The bolt locked open. The empty clip struck metal and air with a sharp, unmistakable note. It was a mechanical signal, a declaration that the rifle was empty. Over time, stories spread. German soldiers were said to listen for it, to wait for it, to charge when they heard it, knowing the American rifleman was momentarily defenseless. The story became legend, but legend is rarely accurate. In the chaos of combat, the battlefield was deafening. Gunfire, explosions, shouting, artillery, and engines drowned out subtle noises. Veterans repeatedly stated that the ping was nearly impossible to hear beyond a few feet. And even if it was heard, it changed very little. American soldiers did not fight alone. While one man reloaded, others continued firing. The supposed window of vulnerability existed mostly in imagination. In some cases, soldiers even exploited the myth. Empty clips were tossed onto rocks or hard surfaces, baiting enemies into revealing themselves. Whether these incidents were common or exaggerated is difficult to say, but the fact remains, the ping became more famous than it ever deserved. What mattered far more was what came before it: the sustained fire, the relentless pressure, the refusal of the American rifle to slow down. The M1 was fed by an internal magazine loaded with an 8-round en-bloc clip. Soldiers locked the bolt open, pressed the loaded clip down into the receiver, and released the bolt. The rifle snapped forward with authority, chambering the first round. Loading had to be learned correctly. The operating rod carried real force. If a soldier failed to control the bolt while loading, his thumb could be caught and crushed. This injury became known as Garand thumb, a painful lesson that taught respect for the mechanism. In training, it happened often enough to earn a reputation. In combat, much less so. Men learned quickly, either through instruction or through pain. Despite early skepticism, the rifle proved durable. It functioned in mud, rain, and dust. It endured heat, cold, and neglect. Regular cleaning kept it running, and American troops quickly developed confidence in it. When the M1 entered combat in the Pacific, its advantages became even more apparent. Japanese forces, accustomed to facing poorly equipped opponents, misjudged American firepower. Banzai charges that once overwhelmed defenders now collapsed under disciplined, continuous rifle fire. Entire assaults were broken before they reached American lines. By the time American forces met the Germans in North Africa, the pattern repeated. German doctrine placed the machine gun at the center of the squad. Riflemen existed to support it. This system worked well, but it meant that the average German soldier relied on a bolt-action rifle for individual engagements. Against the M1, that imbalance became obvious. In one-on-one or small unit encounters, the American rifleman held the advantage. He could fire faster, stay on target longer, and dominate brief windows of exposure. Germany recognized the threat, and they tried to answer it. In the next part, we will examine how Germany attempted to match the Garand, why their efforts failed, and how industrial reality doomed even their best designs.
By nightfall, the island stopped pretending to be quiet. The jungle breathed around them, wet, heavy, alive. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound felt deliberate. The men learned quickly that Guadalcanal did not care who they were or what uniform they wore. The enemy came without warning, not in waves, not with horns or speeches, but in fragments, rifle shots from the dark, footsteps that vanished the moment you turned your head. Sleep became a liability. Lieutenant John George stopped measuring time by hours. He measured it by decisions. Who to move, who to hold back, when to fire, when to wait. Every choice carried weight, and every mistake had a name attached to it. At dawn, they found the cost. Helmets torn open, rifles still clutched in stiff hands, faces frozen between fear and resolve. There was no room left for doubt. The men looked at him now, not for orders written in a manual, but for certainty, for something solid in a place designed to break you down piece by piece. And George understood something then. Survival wasn't about bravery anymore. It was about control. Control over fear, control over chaos, control over the moment when everything inside you tells you to run. As the sun rose over the jungle, he tightened his grip on his weapon. This island was no longer just a battlefield. It was a test, and before it was over, it would decide who would leave as a name carved into history, and who would remain, swallowed by the trees, remembered only by the silence they left behind. The attacks did not stop. They evolved. What began as scattered shots turned into calculated pressure. The enemy learned their routines, their weak hours, the moments when exhaustion made reaction slower by half a second. And on Guadalcanal, half a second was the difference between breathing and bleeding out in the mud. Lieutenant John George adjusted. He shifted positions before dawn. He rotated sentries early, ignoring the protests of men who could barely stand. He taught them to listen, not just for gunfire, but for silence, because silence meant someone was moving. The jungle became a map in his head. Every ridge had a memory. Every tree line had a story. Every open space was a warning. Then came the night that broke the illusion of control. Flares burst overhead, painting the jungle white for a heartbeat. Screams followed, not loud, close, too close. The perimeter folded inward as figures rushed through the darkness, shapes without faces, firing from the hip, trusting chaos to do the rest. George did not shout. He moved. He dragged a wounded man back by the collar, his hands slick with blood he could not tell was his or someone else's. He fired when a shadow detached itself from the trees. He reloaded without looking, muscle memory replacing thought. Minutes stretched into something shapeless,
time lost meaning. When the firing slowed, the ground told the story before anyone spoke. Shell casings everywhere, bodies in positions no one remembered choosing, the air thick with smoke, sweat, and the metallic taste of fear. They had held, barely. At first light, George walked the line. He checked weapons, he checked men. He said nothing unnecessary. His presence alone steadied them more than words ever could. Because by then, everyone understood the truth. Guadalcanal was not about territory, it was about endurance. And the ones who survived were not the strongest, but the ones who adapted fastest to a world that was actively trying to erase them. The island hadn't won yet, but it was learning. As the sun rose once more over Guadalcanal, something had changed. The jungle was the same, the danger was the same. The cost was written clearly in the faces of the men who had survived the night. But the fear was no longer in control. They stood their ground not because they were ordered to, but because they understood what that ground meant. Every yard held the weight of home, of families thousands of miles away, of towns that would never hear the sounds of this jungle, of people who trusted them to hold the line. Lieutenant John George looked at his men and saw more than exhaustion. He saw resolve. These were not conquerors, they were defenders, men who had crossed an ocean not for glory, but because freedom had followed them there. The enemy had learned something on Guadalcanal. American lines did not break easily. American soldiers adapted, and when pushed into the darkest conditions imaginable, they did not disappear into the jungle. They endured. Every sunrise they witnessed was a victory earned the hard way. Every breath taken in that humid air was proof that discipline, unity, and belief could outlast fear itself. Guadalcanal would be remembered not as a place where Americans were tested, but as the place where they proved who they were, not because they were fearless, but because they refused to give in. And in that refusal, quiet, relentless, unyielding, the course of the war began to turn.